So really scaling mindset is all about understanding how you can influence the balance of risk, reward, and confidence, right? So what moves can I make to understand the balance of risk, reward, and confidence?
Welcome back, Modern Commerce subscribers. You're here with Casey and John from Modern Commerce, and we've got another exciting episode for you here today. But before we get into that, John, how you doing, man?
I'm doing well. Had a good week. It's nice. It's summer. Are you doing anything outside? You doing I know I'm like a hermit. I just sit here in my office.
Yeah, I think I hermited up as well most of the time, but and I don't mean to be a downer, but I don't think summer actually starts like officially for like another week or like more maybe. So.
All right. Yeah,
I know I'm that
guy. Okay.
I don't know. It's summer to me too.
Cool.
I'm just saying for those people who know the calendar and break. I mean, we got the calendar snobs out there, and we got to play to them too. So.
Yeah. Sure.
Yeah. Anyway, all summer long, we're going to be coming at you with great Modern Commerce content. If you didn't see last week's episode, or I guess we actually released it earlier this week, we had a draft, man. I enjoyed that episode a lot. It was way fun. It was, it kind of was born from my head, a little different than our other content. So if you need something to kind of break up the real great lessons you learn on this channel, go hit that draft episode up, be a little a break, and just have a little more fun, maybe on a lunch hour or something. But today we have something way more educational, way more helpful, pretty juicy content, I think. Some great tips for scaling Facebook ad accounts. John, what do you have to say about that?
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of like what I really kind of love doing, really get into, so to speak. So just quick before we start, if you need help scaling your ad account, like maybe you're getting decent results, you don't know where to go from here, this episode will be good for you. Or if you're just kind of like an e-commerce brand that wants to grow by acquiring more customers with Facebook ads or Google ads or whatever kind of advertising, check out our agency, Explosive Growth Marketing. We'll have a link in the description. That's essentially what we do. We help e-commerce brands grow by acquiring more customers with ads. So that's what we're going to talk about. And then we're going to talk about one of the biggest channels in e-commerce, Facebook, one of my favorite channels, Facebook, Instagram. So yeah, I'm excited, man. Let's get into it. This would be a good one for you too. You do, Casey, just for kind of context, Casey does a lot of account setups, right? So he kind of helps them get up and running, get off the ground, sets up the initial structure, but oftentimes is kind of handing it off in the scale phase, or is, a lot of, some of our other media buyers are coming in during the scale phase. Casey's moving on to setting up other accounts. So this will be a good one for you because you just don't do this a lot.
Yeah, man, not afraid to eat my humble pie a little bit on these types of discussions. We've alluded to it before, where I kind of have taken the reins a lot more on owned audiences, monetization type of stuff in that vein. But I mean, John is the most educated, highly touted guy that I am aware of in like the paid media, explosive growth, I might even say, of ad accounts, especially on Facebook. I know you've got a ton of experience there. Other sources as well, but today we're keeping it Facebook, Instagram. Yeah, man, let's just crack right into this thing, crack it wide open.
Okay, cool. So I'm going to cover a couple things here. I think, so what we're going to get into is scaling, it's going to be very tactical. I'm going to kind of go through, here's some exact moves you can do. Before we get into that, I need to give a little bit of precursor here and go over just kind of some of the mindsets and foundational things before you even start scaling. You can't just go start scaling an account without having these foundational things. It's pretty important, especially now that iOS 14.5 is rolled out and it's on. Many people have updated their phones. Our data from these ad channels, all ad channels, but Facebook, is becoming less reliable. So the first thing is you need to have internal North Star metrics that are not coming from Facebook. And really, I would say not even coming from a click tracker or Google Analytics or anything like that. You're not trying to complicate your life, by double checking your ad account in Google Analytics or double checking your ad account in some tracking tool like, Wicked Reports or Heroes or any. I'm not saying those tools are bad, but as you're scaling an account, you need some really quick, what we call North Star metrics that are just very true, right? Like, you know that they're true. So, you know, typically what this looks like for e-commerce brands, you know, either what we call MER. MER is just a word for ROAS overall, right? So it's marketing efficiency ratio. So that's like your total revenue or your total net sale. Oftentimes in Shopify, it's good to use like the net sales number for MER, because it accounts for your shipping cost. So it's like your total net sales, your total revenue over your total ad spend across all channels, right? So that's a really common one for e-commerce, is like, we just know that for every dollar we spend on ads overall, we need to make $2.50 or $3 or $4 when we're scaling, right? And when we're growing, that's where we know we're profitable. Because, and the reason I say that is because as you scale, you know, maybe in the early phases, like, you actually might see a 3, let's say 3 is your MER need. You actually might see like a 3 ROAS in Facebook or a 4 ROAS in Facebook. As you scale, you may not see that anymore. You know, Facebook might tell you 2, or it might tell you 8, right? It might tell you any number of things when really you're at a 4 MER, right? So as you scale, the data gets less reliable. So that's the first thing you need, is that like true North Star metric that's like quick and easy for you to check, like spot check today, this week, this month, all of those things, right?
And I'd even add, just to emphasize that point, you know, this isn't just you need to start looking at things in these metrics, these MER type metrics, when you go to scale. You know, in my experience, as I set things up for accounts to hand off to somebody to scale, you know, it's nice to have those in place prior to that, for maybe even a while. That way you kind of know your opportunity cost as you do kind of inflate budgets and do all your scaling attempts. You know, you kind of know what you have, some correlative data.
Right. So that's the first thing, is to understand what the North Star metric is, so you can quick spot check it over any time period. And then to understand what the correlative data, like what the correlation is on platform. We're focusing in on Facebook here. So, you know, the way that you figure out, like, okay, when Facebook says 2, I know my MER is 3 and it's where it needs to be, right? Or when Facebook says 1.5, I know my MER is 3 and where it needs to be. The way you figure that out is like, you know, I can't give you like a sweeping generalization of how every brand should figure that out, because it's different for every brand. It's different depending on how many traffic channels you have and all of the stuff, and where a lot of your sales come from. But yeah, like, you need to figure it out for your brand. And even if you just do it in a rudimentary way of just like gathering the data over the last 30 days or something like that, and understanding like, oh, there seems to be like about this kind of relationship, a 70%, you know, Facebook ROAS is 70% of our MER type of relate. So just come up with that, you know, so you can scale on platforms. So you can kind of look at it and say, you know, this ad's good, this ad's bad. So step 1 is understanding true north. Step 2 is correlating that so that you can look in platform and be able to make decisions in platform. And that's going to be important later as we get into rules. And rules are a little sketchy right now with iOS 14.5, some of the delayed reporting and stuff like that. So you don't have to over-index into rules, and we're going to get into that in a second. But being able to translate that into an ad account metric is sort of part 2 of what I'm talking about, with set your North Star metric, and then, like you're saying, yeah, translate that into what is it in ad account. And it might change, right? So as you scale, you might have to retranslate it, right? And that's fine. But if you're still hitting your North Star, then you can keep scaling, keep correlating, and readjusting that on-platform target.
Right, that's a qualifier. Don't completely ditch the on-platform metrics. You need those, of course, to be able to optimize within that ad platform.
It's going to be a lot easier to scale if you can make decisions just from the on-platform data. If you don't have to go check, you know, cross-reference it with Google Analytics, like I'm saying, or things like that. If you have to do that, it's going to be really hard for you to scale. You know, or you're just going to have to scale more slowly or whatever, right? So, yeah, translate, come up with your North Star metric, translate it to the on-platform metric, and just start there, right? And then just keep an eye on it. You know, that correlation might change, or the on-star metric, or the on-platform metric, sorry, might change, and so just keep an eye on it and adjust.
And one more note, just before we get into more of the meat and potatoes here, if you've been running Facebook traffic for a while now, this also pertains to you. This isn't just for, new people onto the platform who are trying to get started and then scale. With those rollouts, like you mentioned, the iOS updates, things are changing. A lot of the data you have prior might not be super applicable going forward. So you kind of need to, again, just get this frame of reference, start collecting data, and hopefully get to scale, which is where we're headed.
Yeah. So, and then the next point here is like, I don't know, this is maybe like one of those things that people are gonna be like, well, duh, you don't have to say this, but I think a lot of the times people who aren't at the performance target that they want like to read or watch or consume this content about scaling. And then they go try this stuff and they're like, this doesn't work, or this didn't work. And that's because it's content about scaling. It works from the assumption that you're already above your current target, right? So we've used the example of MER, ROAS, we're working from the assumption that you're already above that, or maybe for some e-commerce brands, it's cost per acquisition. So, for like subscription brands or brands that have a really strong lifetime value, a lot of times it's more around the cost per acquisition of a new customer. So, that's like, we're working from the assumption that you're already beating your target and you just want more of that, right? The more you're beating your target by already before, like pre-scale or in your current level of scale or volume, the more confidence and room you have to scale, right? So if you're just already barely beating your target, all of this stuff is applicable to you, but understand if you're already barely beating your target, you probably can't pour very much more fuel on that fire, right? Like your logs are already really burnt up. So just pouring more gas on there is just gonna create some little flashes, but it's not really gonna help you. And it's really gonna burn up those logs you already have faster, right? So if you've got like a nice fire going, scaling is fuel for it. Does that, I don't know if that analogy broke down, but yeah.
No, I was following you. I hope it tracks for the audience as well. Yeah, I think that's important to know. Yeah.
Right. So, and that kind of brings me right into my next point is around scaling mindset, like what you're thinking, how you think about scale, and how you think about scaling an ad account, specifically on Facebook. It's a function of like really a few different variables. It's, it's confidence, it's risk reward, right? So everybody says risk reward, like that's always the assessment, but really there's another level of assessment in risk reward, and that's confidence, right? So we translate this into a different thing in our agency. We call it like the ICE. So it's impact, confidence, ease, right? Like how impactful we think an idea is, how confident we are in that idea, and how easy it is to implement. Translate that a little bit for scaling. You're always assessing how much risk, how much am I exposing myself here? Because essentially what you're doing is you're saying there's a good result. I'm going to give Facebook more money, and I have no guarantee that they will continue to give me this good result. So how much exposure do I have, to use an investing term, right? How much exposure do I have? How much risk am I taking? And what is the reward, right? So there's a risk reward, and then there's a confidence level. The further you are above or better than your like MER or CPA or whatever like target metric need right now, the higher your confidence is, right? So that confidence factor is big. So really scaling mindset is all about understanding how you can influence the balance of risk, reward, and confidence, right? So what moves can I make to understand the balance of risk, reward, and confidence? And scaling really is just moves, right? So the way you set up your ad account, your core marketing strategy, that's all like your scheme, right? So I'm going to use a sports analogy here. And I'm going to say, like, if you're like a basketball player, for example, I'm a basketball guy, I play basketball. Like, there's different archetypes of basketball players. There's, big men, there's shooters, there's, multi-level scorers, there's distributors, playmakers, that kind of thing. So the way you set up your core ad account, that's like the core style of player you are, right? And that's like the skills and abilities and natural talents you have are all around that core style of player. Scaling is about just like moves in your bag. Like, what are the different moves that you can do, to beat a defender, type of thing. So scaling is those like specific skills and moves that players work on and get better So yeah, like all of those moves essentially are just designed to try and manipulate that risk reward confidence balance into your favor. I don't know, were we clear on this? Like, do I need to hammer this anymore?
No, man, I get it. Risk to reward is a real thing. Another thing I can think of with scaling kind of mindset, just I would not be doing my job here as kind of that internal marketer, owned audience marketer. If you're approaching paid media with scaling mindset, let's say you have a business model where you're doing drops weekly or something, one of those new style kind of businesses. But also say, put your best foot forward, give all those new efforts a chance to succeed. You might need to also remember to scale proportionally with other things as well. Does that make sense? Like you might need to.
That's why I say you need the North Star. You need MER.
Exactly. Right? That's why I bring it, because don't just think like, oh, hey, Facebook has been working. Let me put twice of my time, double the amount of time into my Facebook ads and neglect other things, because we are looking at that full picture MER type of marketing. So you need to remember that if I'm going to do twice as many Facebook ads, you need to at least be doing the same amount of emails and other things that you were doing as well. Don't neglect one thing just to feed your stallions, because those stallions will start to starve when they're not getting the reinforcements, kind of, maybe, perhaps.
So I'll give you a good example of this in real life. Drop business, just like you're talking about. They do weekly new product drops and weekly new collection drops. It's in the fashion accessories market, this is common in the fashion accessories market. They do weekly drops, and yeah, a lot of their revenue comes on those drops. Like most of it comes on those drops, and they are scaling. Our North Star metric for scaling is true cost per acquisition, right? So total dollars spent divided by new customers acquired, right? And as long as that's good, we spend. Right. However, that's us as the media buying team, our North Star that we're supposed to look at. However, next level, they have really 4 marketing metrics that push and pull on each other and act as bumpers, right? So one of those is MER. So for example, like the reason this is important is they have a really good lifetime value. So their average customer doubles in value in like a 2-month time period. So a business like that, they may be able to actually pay a little more to acquire that customer than what their real MER goal is. So they might have an MER goal of like 5, and they might be willing to acquire that customer at like a 1 ROAS or like a 2 ROAS, and that's the case here. They have a real MER goal of around 5, and they're willing to acquire new customers at about a 2 ROAS, right? So their average order value is about $90, and they're willing to acquire new customers at about $45. If we were to pour, like, let's say we were killing the cost per acquisition, and we just poured, like, at a certain point, we would pour so much money into that they would tip their MER and they wouldn't be at 5 anymore, right? So they would outpace what they could do on their drops with their acquisition, right? So that MER, like yes, as a media buying team, CAC is our North Star, but MER acts as a bumper for that, right? So they don't outscale their needs to be profitable. Right. That's kind of like a good example of what you're saying. And I don't know if that's maybe going to be contextualized for a lot of people. Maybe a lot more people are in the position where they're like, well, I already need to acquire at my MER target or at my ROAS target, profitability target. And that's fine, right? So then that kind of makes your life simpler. It's going to make it so you have less opportunity for scale than a company like that. But it does make your life more simple for sure.
Right. And if you're some brand owner who's super with it, hopefully this is all making sense to you in exactly the terms you need to hear, because this is kind of that, like we said, that kind of full view picture of marketing. But maybe you're watching this and you're just some media buyer at an agency and you actually have a pretty limited scope. This is also really helpful for you to hear this stuff, because even if you can't impact every one of those, like you're talking about like 4 corners kind of marketing, even if you can only impact 1 quadrant for a business, it's still nice to be able to like gather some other data, maybe from whoever you get data from about the other ones, so you can have fewer hidden variables and understand more why things are happening.
Yeah, understand the feedback they're going to give you, Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
So otherwise, if you're just in a silo all day looking at just numbers on an ad platform, even if they are completely accurate, which nowadays that's not really the case all the time. We know there's a certain amount of attribution grab going on any platform, and you just want to limit the amount of hidden variables you have. The more you know, the better you're going to be on.
Right. So cool. Let's get into some of the scaling tactics, some of the scaling moves.
Let's do it, man.
So first up, and this is actually like kind of coming right off of our risk reward sort of mindset, understanding risk reward, is I'm going to move right into this one, scaling by testing, which is kind of crazy because it's like, oh, testing isn't scaling, right? But like, some people call this horizontal scaling. I'm going to say like really scaling by testing is more accurate, because all of these things should actually still be giving you information about what performs best for you. So if you get into a phase where scale isn't as good and numbers aren't as good, you know the different variables that perform best for you. So when you are in a position when you are in a position where you are exceeding your CPA or ROAS or MER or whatever target you have, when you're in that position, your tests will have a higher, what we call a hit rate, right? So this is, a good way to put this, again, in investing terms, is in a bear market, you're gonna have like more tests that fail. So you have to be very cognizant and prioritize your tests and say, here are the most important tests to do. In a bull market, you're gonna have more tests that win and hit and are profitable. So you can test more rapidly. So if you're in a scaling phase, the very first thing I always do in a scaling phase is I don't go in and increase budgets and do stuff like that. I accelerate my testing, because I take my winning, and the way that works in, I'm not going to work from if you set your ad account up in this way. That's how a lot of people kind of go through this scaling content. They tell you how to set your ad account up initially for scale. Like, I'm going to try and stick to moves that work really no matter how you set your ad account up. But here are the different kind of core moves. And I know how I set up ad accounts so that I can easily execute these moves. And that's maybe a whole other discussion. If Casey, you want to ask questions about that, I'm happy to answer those. But the core moves are, I take winning creatives and I launch them to new audiences that I'm not testing yet. Some of my favorite audiences to test are stacked lookalikes. So this is like an uncommon one people do, or like where they're maybe stacking if a lookalike's working really well for you, like a 1% lookalike of your purchasers, I'll stack that and I'll say, I'm going to do an audience with 1% lookalike of purchasers, people who've added to cart, people who've initiated checkout. So stacked lookalikes to make those larger. I test big versus small on lookalikes. So I'm going to test a 10% and a 1% of my winning type of lookalike. I'm going to test interest and broad. So I'm going to test a large interest that's like super wide, big interest. If I'm selling stuff to runners, I'm going to test like running, I'm going to then test also. And so then I have my control of in this case that I'm saying, I have my control of my best performing audience is a 1% lookalike. I'm going to take my creatives that are performing well with it, and I'm going to test it with a stacked lookalike. I'm going to test it with a 10% lookalike. I'm going to test it with a really broad interest. I'm going to then test it also with a really narrow interest, like, maybe Chicago Marathon, Boston Marathon, LA Marathon, and runner's world, right? Like, so I'm using running because I kind of know that industry a little bit. That's about 1 million person audience. It's narrow, right? So I'm going to go broad interest, narrow interest, and then I'm going to go broad, wide open, USA. So those are some of my favorite audiences to go to. I also like kind of offbeat lookalikes. So I like lookalikes of, if you're using video ads, lookalikes of high percentage video viewers. So if you got a 30-second video, 50, 75% video viewers make a great lookalike, because it's usually a really big audience. So but it's a really quality audience too. So those are good lookalikes. Lookalikes of people who've been on the top 25%, top 10%, top 5% time on site, that kind of thing. So kind of some of those offbeat lookalikes are good too. So I'm varying my audiences: big interests, small interests, broad, different types of lookalikes, different sizes of lookalikes. The feedback I'm getting here is, do lookalikes with bigger seed audiences perform better than lookalikes with smaller, really high quality seed audiences? Do bigger lookalikes perform better than smaller lookalikes? Do stacked lookalikes perform better than non-stacked lookalikes? Which is actually kind of a variation of the bigger, smaller. Do bigger interests perform better than smaller interests? Do interests outperform lookalikes? Does broad outperform lookalikes? Does broad outperform? I'm gathering all this data about what are the, like directionally, what are the types of audiences that work well, right? Because then from there, depending on what I get back, let's say I learn, hey, stacked outperforms non-stacked and bigger lookalikes outperform smaller lookalikes. I'm going to stack bigger lookalikes now. Hey, these, you know, lookalikes with big seed audiences like my video viewers outperform my purchase lookalike. Now I'm going to start stacking those, right? And so building blocks here, right? And through all of that, I'm going to have a lot of winning tests. So I'm going to have I'm scaling, right? Like I'm launching more ad sets or more things into my CBO campaign, and I'm raising the budget on the CBO campaign in order to launch those more things. However I've set it up, I'm scaling by basically just testing more stuff, right? And that's on the audience side. And then the same thing on the creative side. So on the creative side, it looks like iterations on my winning creatives. So really simple ones are take your best performing asset and just run multiple copy variations of it. Take your best performing copy, run multiple asset variations of it. You might be doing that already. And then vary your best performing asset in small ways, you know, and try that and run all of this with your control audience, whatever audience is performing best. So again, I'm launching more things essentially at the ad set level, or I'm just launching more things, which that makes me have to add more budget, more or less. You know, even if I'm using CBOs, that makes me have to add more budget. If I'm launching more stuff and I'm testing more stuff, and some of it will lose, but if you're in a bullish period with your ad account, you're going to have a lot of wins, and you're going to be able to gather data on this. The last thing I do is test different ad account settings. So, you know, I might optimize my placements at the ad set level. I might test stories only with my best performing audience. I might test like 7-day click versus 1-day click. I might test trying like only feed placements. I don't really do that much anymore. That's low on my priority list. Test value versus conversions. You know, with value, you have to have value set up in your ad account, you know, with your events management, but just different stuff like that, right? So testing ad set level settings. So again, basically just launching more stuff, launching more tests that are really giving me feedback about what performs best, but are also scaling me. And that honestly, oftentimes, in a bullish period, I'm launching those tests at a high rate that oftentimes gets me to scale quicker than anything, right? So you might go from like $1,000 a day to $10,000 a day just doing that, you know, right. in a week, you know, and with relatively low risk, because you're kind of taking winning variables and just putting them with new slight variations.
Right, yeah. So as far as scaling goes, I would say this horizontal type of scaling that you're talking about, this is what I'm more familiar with, right? Because especially starting out, like you said, setting up a new account, getting ready to pass it on to somebody else in our agency like I do, you know, we're just trying to establish, you know, some control variables. We're trying to kind of set benchmarks and just try to figure out what we're dealing with at first. And horizontal scaling makes a ton of sense there, right? Because you just need to go into mass like data collection mode, basically, right?
This is the same thing you do when your ad account isn't performing where you want it to do. You just do it faster when your ad account is performing well. So
this is what my question is kind of around then. So when you do have that padding built up for yourself and that MER, when you aren't, you know, you're a bootstrap business, sure, probably, but you've got some cushion to play with. It makes sense to be able to keep horizontally scaling because it's working, right? Sure. And if it's not working, if it's not so bullish, right? If you're in more of this like bear type situation, I have a feeling you would be more, you would feel like you need to move more towards some kind of vertical scale. And I don't want to put the cart ahead of the horse here, because I know you're kind of going to get into that vertical scaling a little bit more. But is that kind of, as far as mindset goes here, like you touched on earlier, is that kind of is that a healthy mindset to have, or as you're feeling the pressure that like you feel like you're being forced into this vertical thing, is it even more important there to try to find more of this horizontal type of scaling that works?
No, so again, remember risk reward is your assessment lens, right? So every new test you launch carries some risk and it carries some reward. And the less margin you have between where you're at and what your target is and which side of the line you're on, the less confidence you have in a new test, which increases its risk factor. And the less, really, if you're not in a bullish period, I'm here to tell you that you're not going to find some audience that crushes all the other ones by 2 or 3x, right? That just doesn't happen. You're going to maybe, I mean, that's going to happen with like an offer or a landing page or maybe a really like awesome creative typically, right? So, yeah, I mean, that does, I don't know if that helps answer your question, but if you're really close in your margin of error, then you really don't have a ton of room for scale anyway. So yeah, it's just a less it's not really slow testing where you're picking one test at a time or 2 tests at a time that are most impactful, or really fast where you're launching everything. It's a continuum, right? And the closer, the more, the less padding you have in terms of risk, reward, and confidence, the more selective you have to be about the most impactful test. Typically speaking, right now, as of June 2021, the most impactful tests are creative tests, which I'm also going to bucket landing pages and offers in with creative, which a lot of times as media buyers, we don't actually have control over the offer. Maybe we have control over the landing page. But yeah, I mean, do you feel like that helps answer your question? So what you're doing there is you're saying, I have some level of proven stuff in my ad account. I have to watch the ratio, or I have to be aware and cognizant of the ratio of unproven stuff to proven stuff. And how aware of that ratio I have to be has to do with my risk, reward, and confidence, right? So if you've got a ton of padding built up for the month, your NER is way beyond for the month, you have low risk, right? Because you have all that padding built up, but you have really high reward because those could be winners. Whereas if you don't have that padding built up, your risk is higher, your exposure is higher, and your confidence level is lower, right? So you have to be a little bit more selective about those tests, and you can't launch them in as accelerated of a fashion. You have to be more aware of like spending a higher percentage of your budget on stuff that's proven and is getting you your target.
Right. Yeah. I think you answered a good portion of that question. I know you're getting into vertical.
To me, it looks more. I'll clarify this. To me, it looks less like trying to vertical scale that stuff that is getting you target, and looks more like probably you're just not scaling as much. You're not launching as much stuff, and you're not scaling as much.
That is kind of what I was touching on a little bit there. If you find this type of stuff generally works, but there's thin barrier there between where your margin is, where your metrics are, and then you launch new stuff and it just crosses that line where it's close, but it doesn't quite do it. I could see a lot of people going, well, I need to vertical scale this stuff that is working, even though it is thin. I'm interested to see what mindset you would actually tell somebody to have with that.
It's right. So your logic there is strong. What's most likely going to happen though is that you're going to eat up that margin by trying to vertical scale that thing that's working.
Right.
So
what you would actually say,
what's really happening there is that you don't actually have room for very much scale.
Right. So what you would actually recommend to that person is to click the link in the description and check out our agency and have somebody help you with that.
Right. So if you, Casey, were asking me this internally, I would say, okay, well, really, yeah, like maybe get a little more vertical scale out of that if you can. But what you really need is to be selective about your tests, prioritize the highest priority test that has the most likelihood to give you more margin. Right. So once we've got more margin, like if we have a really strong creative hit or something like that, that gives us more margin above that. Well, that has more room for vertical scale without eating it. And now we've got more space to test more things, so really like if you're kind of in that situation, which is a very common situation to be in, what the signal really is that with your current combination of creatives, winning audiences, and just generalized Facebook algorithm offer, that kind of thing, landing page, you just don't really have that much room for scale. And so you have to change some variable to give yourself room for scale, and you have to prioritize that variable so that you're not, testing a whole bunch of stuff. Look, you actually, if you want to test a whole bunch of stuff at once and, just be like, okay, well, we might be unprofitable this month because we're testing a bunch of stuff. Yeah, that will help you learn faster, but you'll be probably unprofitable because most of it will lose. So if you want to stay profitable and you want to find that factor, you just have to be very good internally at saying like, well, here are all the things we could test. Here are the things that are highest priority to probably give us, the most impact and get us margin. So you're over-indexing on impact on your testing ideas there.
Right. So I just kind of wanted to touch on that. That's what I figured you'd say, something along those lines, because I imagine the next part here with vertical scaling doesn't pertain to people who are hanging on by a prayer because something is working, but nothing else works. That doesn't mean start vertical scaling hard on what is working, because that's just going to probably dig you into a hole, more likely than not, at least, you know?
Yeah, then you're just going to have really nothing that's working, probably.
But if you are working horizontally, I imagine there at some point, you're going to want to figure out how to vertically scale the stuff that is working too, right?
That's exactly it. So budget scaling, vertical scaling oftentimes works best when horizontal scaling is really already working as well. Like, so you've got margin between your target and where you're at, and like kind of things are working. Your ad accounts in what you would categorize as a bullish period, not a neutral period, not a bearish period. So yeah, in this case, oftentimes when we manage risk by really not putting quite as much budget as we'd like. So one of the ways I accelerate testing, going back to horizontal scaling, is I actually start launching with the budget that I want. You know, so I'm launching at higher budgets. And then I'm taking, you know, things that are working and I'm just putting more budget on them. Very simply, if it's working, if it's either the more margin, the more, again, confidence, risk, reward there is, I'm making that assessment when I put more budget on something, and, you know, considering the cadence and stuff like that. Now, generalized rule here, you can make bigger budget moves on a CBO than an ad set budget. Some people make budget moves daily. In our current Facebook, I've done that. It's fine. In our current Facebook environment with iOS 14.5, I probably wouldn't recommend trying to day trade your account. You know, it's just not really working, at least on our accounts right now, because there's sort of this delayed reporting where today's data might not be accurate. Like, you know, it might report a conversion a couple days later. I don't want to get into that, but we also have day of action reporting instead of day of click reporting now, and all this stuff. So yeah, some people like to make budget moves daily. I'm not going to tell you how, like, you know, give you the 20% rule. What I will say, you know, the 20% rule is essentially like, don't increase an ad set budget by more than 20% if it's an ad set. You know, if it's a CBO, it's 50%. These are things that kind of people in the generalized ethos of Facebook throw out there. I'm going to go ahead and say, like, it's all situational. You know, like, if you're double your MER target, you've got a bunch of room, you've got a bunch of padding. We've quadrupled CBOs, we've quadrupled ad set budgets. You know, sometimes that's what we're doing because we're just really highly confident, you know, and our risk, and we don't have a lot of risk because we have padding, and, you know, our reward is really high because things are working right now. So it's like, you know, that understand the risk reward assessment when you're making your budget moves. Generally speaking, though, I like to get my budgets up to the point where, and this is going to be like a lot of people in the way they structure their ad accounts, when they say this, they're going to be like, holy crap, that's a lot of budget at the campaign level if they're using CBOs. I like each of my ads within a campaign to have, like, so to have enough budget on the campaign for each of my ads to get 5 conversions a day, or enough budget on the ad set for each of the ads to get 5 conversions a day. That's what I like. But if you got 5 ads in there, you know, you're essentially at like 25x, you're going to 25 conversions a day on the ad set. You know, if you've got 10 ad sets in a campaign, 250 conversions at the campaign level. Now, even if we have a $10 cost per conversion, which isn't common, you know, most of it's, you know, a lot of e-commerce is anywhere from 20 to 100. We could be talking about some pretty big campaign level budgets here. So you don't have to go there right away. So the increments by which you get there are up to you, and they depend on risk, reward, confidence. But once you kind of can, if you can get your budgets to that level, I find you get really strong consistency, and your decision making gets really easy because you get a lot of conversions on a daily basis. So you can tell over a 3-day period if an ad's fatigued or if an ad set's, you know, dying or something like that, right?
And I think this speaks to the risk reward mindset too, that assessment. I think it's important to hammer on. There's always a reassessment too.
Right.
You know, if you're that person who is just setting it and forgetting it for a week, you know, certainly you'll be looking at reassessing every week. But if you're that person who's a little more confident, you know, playing with stuff on a daily basis or like every few days or something, you know, that ongoing data feed that you're getting should inform you on your other decisions as you go. And it sounds like a lot of this, what you're kind of talking about, if I could put it in, you know, it's that push and pull from the horizontal to the vertical scaling. How much do you take from the horizontal, which again is already working if you're going to vertical scaling? How much do you take from that to vertically scale something? And I think the answer is, you know, it depends on the results. obviously, right? You'll have the data you need then at that time. You don't need to go leaning out over a ledge because you're making informed decisions at this point.
Yep. So, and then again, we're not working with any kind of set. Some people like to put 50 ads into an ad set. We have a media buyer at Explosive Growth that likes to put 50 ads into the ad sets. This is the max. So, but you know, some people like to put 50 ads into the ad set. So we're talking a lot of budget per ad set. And if you got a few ad sets in your campaign, ridiculously high budgets. But my other benchmark is about 10 conversions per day per ad set. You know, and that's not even that far off Facebook's recommendation. They're kind of like somewhere in the 7 zone. So like, I like 10 conversions per day per ad set. You know, that's good if you use a lot of ads, or really it's just a good benchmark on your way to, you know, 5 conversions per ad. So a lot of times when I'm in a scale phase, I will start in my horizontal scaling, and in my scaling by testing, I will be launching, I will be calculating my budgets where I'm launching at 10 conversions per day per ad set, whether the budget's at the campaign level or the ad set level. 10 conversions per day per ad set. And that makes it easier. Like, you're getting a better data feed, so it makes it easier for you to budget scale your way up to that 5 conversions per ad, you know, because some of those ads will get cut along the way and stuff like that, right?
So because you've been responsibly building that padding in your horizontal and then vertical scaling, now you can do that horizontal scaling a little bit at the higher amounts because you've built that padding up, and you can go a little more trial by fire with new stuff, and you'll know quickly whether it's going to work or not. So again, the risk reward is still kind of intact. That makes sense.
Yeah, right? Exactly. Right. And I know I'm going to have, if I'm in a bullish period, I know I'm going to have plenty of winners to offset my losers. I'm going to find out their losers quickly, and I'm going to move on from them.
Which is like, I mean, again, to that person who's like super bootstrapped and just barely over that line, that's okay. Like it's a
good way to crash
exactly
way really quickly. Yeah.
Exactly. Not exactly for them, but for the people who are in that bullish situation, it isn't that bad of an idea to take some big swings and learn stuff quickly, right?
Exactly.
Do you see that sometimes where people are afraid to launch stuff at the higher amount and take the swings?
Oh yeah. Because it's like, feel like you're not dancing with the one that brought you, right? Like,
I mean, how many times have you told me
that got you there? And what I'm saying is, like, remember that your core scheme and core setup, that's the kind of player you are, right? Now we're talking about moves, right? So you know, if I'm a basketball player, if I'm kind of a multi-level scorer, that's the kind of player I am. So I have a lot of scoring moves, though, depending on what my defender's doing, right? So it's not that you're not dancing with the one that brought you. You're just using different moves from your bag to feed the kind of core player that you are. Right?
And I feel like this speaks directly to that person who is handling their own media buying, maybe, because they have a little bit more responsibility throughout the whole brand.
Money, they're a little more scared. Yeah.
And I mean, years ago you told me this, and it always rings in my head. None of these things, none of these ad sets, none of these ads, none of these audiences, none of them are your babies. None of them are your babies. You can cut them, they're gone. They're not your babies. So you don't have to dance the one that brought you there. And, you know, when you see something else out there that looks nice, you know, go for it. Like, it's not like a lot of decisions you make in real life.
Right. Yeah. I mean, look at it more like an investor looks at their portfolio, you know, oftentimes. So, you know, I don't know, maybe not, like, maybe that's a bad analogy, because there's a lot of different investing approaches. People are like, no, I buy long and hold and whatever. Right. So, like, I don't know, maybe ignore that analogy.
That's a can of worms there.
Yeah. Let's not go down that rabbit hole. But, like, yeah, essentially kind of what I'm saying is that, like, if you are still too worried to launch at a higher, then really you're internally making that risk reward assessment, and you might be right. You know,
you might be right, but you also might be capping your success.
Exactly. You might be right with your risk reward confidence assessment, but actually maybe start writing it out and saying, like, scale of 1 to 10, what is my risk for, like, you know, I like to plan my buys, right? I'd like to plan my media and say, here are the ad sets I'm going to launch. Here are the creatives that are going to go in that ad set. Here's the campaign structure, whether the campaign, you know, what campaigns it's going to go into, or, you know, which, you know, what the campaign level budget will be, or the ad set level budget. Like, I like to plan this all out in a sheet, like in a Google sheet, Excel sheet, and, like, essentially lay out, like, how much money I'm going to be putting out on the line, right? And so maybe even write it out and say, my risk here is 7, my reward here is a 9, and my confidence here is a 9. You know, and maybe you're like, I don't like that, right? So I'm going to launch a little bit less budget per ad set, or I'm just going to launch less stuff, right? So that's actually in the bullish period. I would recommend starting to move toward launching stuff at a higher budget and launching less stuff if you are not feeling good about your risk reward confidence layout, right? So just decide that you're not going to launch some of those, you know, the 10 tests that you're about ready to launch in your horizontal scale and your test scale by testing. Do 5 of them at a higher budget instead of 10 of them at a lower budget if you're in a bullish period.
I think that could be a huge nugget of wisdom for people, because I think, especially those bootstrap people who are taking on that role for themselves, I think a nice, responsible, kind of conservative buying person might lean into that. I have a bunch of things I think will work, and I kind of just want to hit them one by one. But again, why do you have all those things? Why do you have all those priorities to test if you're never going to take the leap with something and build yourself barrier there too? Because if that thing does scale vertically, you're just building up more barrier for yourself to test more things than to and work out the priorities.
Confidence to scale it vertically. If you get 1 conversion every 3 days, how do you know if you can really add budget to that? You know what I mean? So, well, I mean, I remember when I actually used to struggle a little more with scaling. And the biggest breakthrough I had, this was maybe one of the biggest years of my career where I like really scaled some brands like to a different level of like life, right? Like their brand is something different now than it was before, right? And they're creating jobs now where before they were barely paying themselves, and stuff like this was, you know, like this mindset of the easiest way to scale is to just start high, but protect yourself, right? So that's what I'm teaching you here, right? So these next 2 things I'll go into are more of like, here are some moves you can put in the bag to protect yourself. So the first is bidding, manual bidding. So budget scaling and testing, scaling by testing, you're making the risk reward assessment and deciding how much of it you can do, right? Risk reward confidence assessment and deciding how much of it you can do. My recommendation to sum all that up is to start trying to start higher, right? With your budgets in general, right? Get more data through. Again, caveat on all this is that you actually have room for scaling in your ad account. So
right,
now
you can't scale out of bad initial performance. That's
right, exactly. So now let's talk about some safety nets and some moves you can put in your bag to like cap your downside and manage the risk side of that equation. So first is manual bidding. So a couple moves I like to use here is I launch CBO. So once I get into a scaling phase, I'll usually launch a CBO, a cost cap and a bid cap CBO, because you can't do with CBOs, you can't do multiple bidding styles within one campaign. So I launch a cost cap and a bid cap CBO. I always start things with lowest cost in most accounts. In some accounts, I default to cost cap. We don't get into that. We're not getting into account setup and initial strategy right now. We're talking about scaling. So, you know, in a scaling phase, I almost always launch a CBO that's a cost cap and a CBO that's a bid cap, and I put big budgets on it. I'm just going to use that word, big. You know, you can translate that to what, again, risk, reward, confidence. I duplicate all my winning ad sets into those CBOs. And I typically bid about whatever I'm getting for my cost per conversion, plus about maybe 25 or 30%. It's where I start the bidding. And then I walk the bid up or down, you know, to get per ad set, I walk the bid up or down inside that campaign to get the delivery and efficiency I want, right? So it's like, oh, it's really good, but it's not getting enough spend. I'm going to just walk the bid up 5, 10% at a time. Again, it could be 15 or 20% at a time. Again, risk reward confidence in those decisions. You know, for both bid cap and cost cap, I'll do that. And oftentimes I'll find one of the campaigns actually gets a little bit better, you know, quote unquote performance. So volume and efficiency combination than the other. So one way of bidding is better than the other. It's not across accounts. So sometimes it's bid cap, sometimes it's cost cap. So yeah, that's one of the first things I do. You can also do that if you're using ad set budget campaigns. I almost always have an ABO campaign in my ad accounts, especially an account where I'm scaling. So again, duping ad sets into a into a manual bid. So manual bidding is one thing that you can do, and that's like a really easy kind of like walk up, walk down method that you can do to sort of like give yourself some safety nets on that big budget that you set, right? Either at the ad set budget level if you're using ABOs, or at the campaign level. And then rules. So caveat on rules is right now rules are a little sketchy with iOS 14.5. So really, I would hedge toward manual bidding instead of rules. The struggle with manual bidding is if you have really low, like let's say you have low average order values and really low cost per purchases. We're again going with e-commerce. So like if your cost per purchase is $10, $20, it's going to be hard for you to get delivery with manual bidding. You know, if you're not, unless you're bidding 2 or 3 times your cost per purchase. So it becomes less of a safety net then. So rules work a little bit better traditionally for ad accounts like that, but you know, right now they're a little sketchy. But I will just tell you sort of some of the core rules I use.
And sketchy because conversions don't always track right now, things like that. Is that
don't always track right now? There's a delayed reporting of conversions. So depending on the frequency that you're running your rules at and stuff like that, and we could get deep into rules. Some people like to run rules daily. I basically right now I would advise not running your rules daily and being aware that some of these rules might really cut things prematurely. You know, because maybe they actually did crush that day, but Facebook, because of the 72-hour delayed reporting rule, hasn't reported any of the conversions yet. So the first is a stop loss. So this is simple. It can happen at the ad level or the ad set level. And it is, we are going to stop, we're going to turn off this ad or ad set if it gets to this much in spend and it hasn't gotten a conversion, right? So there's lots of variations there. Like we can say, well, if it's at this add to cart cost or whatever, again, I wouldn't play with those variations on higher funnel conversions right now because those are even less reliable than the core conversion that you're going after. But yeah, that's stop loss. Simple. If it gets to this much spend, hasn't had a conversion, turn it off. The second rule is a kind of a trim, what I call a trim the fat rule. I didn't come up with that name. A trim the fat rule is typically like, again, we're trimming the fat. We're not leaning up all the way with this rule. So we're saying, hey, once it's hit a certain level of spend, if it's this far over my target, then cut it, right? It doesn't have to be at target, but it has to be this close to it, right? So it's usually like, you know, if it's at my target plus 20% or 25%, so my target cost per purchase is $20, you know, I might say, hey, if it's above $25 cost per purchase, then cut it. Right, so that's a trim the fat rule. And then the next version of that is a hard stop rule. So usually a stop loss rule kicks in at the lowest level of spend. Trim the fat rule sometimes kicks in at the same level as stop loss, but maybe a little bit higher. A hard stop rule kicks in at a higher level of spend where we're going to say, all right, we're done giving it that 25% margin, right? Like once it's spent a certain amount or it's got a certain number of conversions, it's either at target or it's not. We're done giving it you know, a 25% body fat or a 20% body fat. You can step it down too, right? Like you can go from 20% to 15 to 10, tons of variations here, but these are just the core rules. And then the last rule is an optional one, and that is a relight. So sometimes, you know, you'll turn something off and then delayed conversions will come into it and it will actually be performing well. So this is particularly true in the stop loss rule. Or the hard, and not so much in the hard stop rule because you should be setting the spend level high enough that it can't really come back. So particularly in the stop loss rule, you might cut something a little prematurely. And then so you can use a relight rule where you essentially go through things that are turned off. And if they are now at target, you turn them back on. So again, we can get deep into like what time periods you can run these on and stuff like that. That's all optional. That's just like the core mindsets that keep it. So like, you're just not running, there's an automated machine that isn't allowing things, that is cutting things quicker than you will as a human and is doing it without any emotion. So you can think through the rules and then just like, you're not making judgment calls, which I actually think making judgment calls is okay if you're an experienced media buyer. But a lot of times at scale, you want to just say, I don't want to make judgment calls, right? Like I want to run the scheme, I want to run these rules and come what may. And then if I feel like I'm going in there and I'm looking and my judgment says these rules aren't right, I'm not going to turn the rules off and start making judgment calls. I'm going to make adjustments to the rules. So I've seen some accounts scale really well when the media buyer stopped making as many decisions and just focus on optimizing the rules. and putting good new creatives and good new tests into the ad account.
Right, and this is where I eat that humble pie. I have not used rules in a big way in any ad accounts that I've been connected to. This stuff's super interesting. I know, I have the mind to understand how rules could kind of elevate you beyond that like human choice kind of emotional buying you can get into sometimes. I think nobody is immune to that, right? But obviously all the rules are. But every now and again, at least in the circles we run into stuff with media buyers, you can hear stories, right? How you thought all the way through all of the rules, and you thought, oh, this is foolproof, this is set up. I mean, I can leave this for a few days and it's going to go exactly how I want, regardless of results. Things can go bad, but they'll stop themselves on time and stuff. But sometimes that's not always the case, right? We've heard stories of that. So maybe there's an example you could use where somebody in your experience thought they were foolproof, airtight, but that wasn't the case. Do you have any?
So two things. One, you need to monitor and optimize your rules, just like you optimize. That's part of optimizing your ad account. So that's one side of it, is that like the rules that you start with oftentimes need tweaking to be just right. And then even as things shift in the world, the market, the ad account, your creatives, whatever, they need further tweaking and optimization, right? So you just kind of focus on that rule optimization. The other thing is the actual logic of setting them up, right? So like, if this, then this, almost always the first time you set up rules, most media buyers, you like set the logic up incorrectly, and something that was supposed to turn off doesn't turn off, or it turns off and back on a bunch of times, or whatever. Like they didn't really think through the logic correctly when they set it up. And I mean, like literally, if spend is greater than this and this is true, then turn this off. And then something happens and something spends a bunch and they're like, why didn't that turn off? And they realize like, oh, that doesn't actually meet the exact logic I told the AI to use, right? Even though it does meet it like in my head, it doesn't meet the exact logic. So when you set up rules, especially if you're first timer, just monitor them. Monitor what happens in the ad account after you set up those rules. Everybody should, because everybody should be optimizing their rules on an ongoing basis, but just be ready for, yourself to have not set them up correctly. So again, understand that in your risk reward confidence assessment. Don't be like, oh, I have rules, so I can just like spend 2,000 times more than I've ever spent. Understand that if it's the first time you ever set up rules, you probably set some of them up wrong, and Facebook's going to run away with a little bit of money before you catch it. So don't, over-index on those rules.
But it sounds like to me the common denominator I'm kind of hearing from you is even once you get past that point where you do kind of have your head wrapped around the logic, you don't have mistakes per se in your rules. It still sounds to me like you're saying none of those rules, even a rule that's helped you, that there's certain rules you're like, oh man, these have just been helping me so much, raised me to this new height in this ad account. It's still not my child. I can still adjust that rule. Numbers are going to have to change and evolve. That's a common theme I hear from you, no matter how in-depth a discussion we get. Stay water, stay flexible, always be reassessing that risk to reward. That's the stuff that I hear coming from you, basically, whatever avenue.
Especially in a scaling phase, you know what I mean? Like it's like you set your rules around a certain number, but maybe the correlation between your MER and your in-ad account ROAS changes, and you just need to change the ROAS number on those rules, or the cost per purchase number on those rules, So yeah, that's really it, is that like, the core principles of the rules. So the rules are a little bit more so that like the core principle of them is still true, like hard stops, trim fats, cut, that kind of stuff. That's all still true. But it maybe needs to be adjusted on an ongoing basis. Yeah. Cool. Yeah. So yeah, that's all I've got for you today.
Sorry, yeah. Sorry, we had a little glitch there. But so what this whole discussion's been great, very informative for me. It's been kind of a doozy. This one might actually be like a two-parter. I don't know. This is one of our longer videos, I think. And I can just see it in your eyes too, that all the, like, as we get into the rules, the manual bidding and stuff, I'm like, oh, these almost sound like topics for like a whole episode in and of themselves in the future, maybe, because you've got I can just see it. You're holding back on me a little bit on some of this stuff for time's sake. But But yeah, man, so sticking to our format here, at least, I wanna give you the chance. I know we've been running a little long here. Like, this might be 2 episodes in one. I don't know. We'll see how I end up cutting it before we upload it. But John, parting shot on this massive kind of topic that we have here, as far as how to scale a Facebook ad account, super general kind of thing. We went over a lot of stuff. I'm interested to hear what you have to say as far as the parting shot goes.
Yeah, I mean, I said it at the beginning, really, is that scaling is more about mindset and assessment of risk, reward, and confidence. So just keep remembering that, right? So, like, again, just remember the core foundational pieces I went over at the beginning, and you'll be okay, right? And all these tactics and stuff, you try them, and you'll gain, like, if you're like, I don't really get, that's the stuff that's more interesting, like whatever, on that early stuff. Remember the early stuff. So remember the mindset around it, risk, reward, confidence. Remember to have a true North Star, and remember to correlate that to an in-ad account metric. As you try some of this tactical stuff, it will all contextualize. But if you do that foundational stuff, and you have the right mindset around scaling, you're gonna have a lot easier time, a lot better time scaling, and you're gonna, like, over time, as you do some reps on some of these moves, you'll start to learn. Like, again, I like to make the basketball analogy, because the best basketball players, they get taught combinations, they get taught counters, and they got, like, the combinations and counters are types of moves they can use to do what they want to do in different situations. And then the best basketball players come up with their own versions and variations of those combinations and counters, so that they have moves that, like, other people haven't seen. So the big thing people always say about Steph Curry is that he's 2K, he's changed the game. Like, it's like somebody's playing 2K when they're playing with him, or when he's playing the game. It's because it's the same combinations, counters that everybody's learned. He's just come up with different variations and different ways to use them, and just different ideas. He understands the core reason he's doing the counter and combination. He understands the foundational piece of reading a defender. And so now he's come up with different ways to expose that defender, or to beat that defender. So same thing here, just remember those foundational pieces, go through the moves, gain context on them. But if you remember that, hey, I'm manipulating risk, reward, and confidence, that's what I'm doing as I scale, you'll come up with your own ways to do it, really.
All right, awesome, man. Appreciate you hanging out with me and talking scaling on Facebook with me. Guys, if you're watching still, thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, hit that bell so you get all of our videos. You get notified when they get posted. We're playing with some live premieres too, so feel free to jump into the live chat and say something. Don't be scared. Trying to build this up so we got a whole network of people discussing high-level topics for e-commerce brands in the here and now. Stuff that's relevant for now and for the future, hopefully. So, until next time, as always, we'll see you.